So, in this brief description of research ethics, it's very important to understand that there are structures in place as it relates to conducting research with human beings, as well as structures in place as it relates to conducting research with non human animals. And uh, if you look at the American Psychological Association, they have a standard, which is a series of guidelines for research. It's called Standard 8. And it goes through all of the things that need to be in place to conduct research. There's also a companion guideline as it relates to animal research. So um, this is a very brief, distilled version of some of the principles that you need to know when we talk about research methods. So, in the previous video, we talked about deception. Now, there's a concept called a straightforward manipulation with an experiment, and then there's deception. A straightforward manipulation is an experiment that you make it clear to the participant what the nature of the study is. And in fact, there is something called a consent form that requires you to state some purpose of the study. So a straightforward manipulation, it's going to be very clear to the participant as to what is happening. Now, I said to you, there are times when knowing the full nature of the study could alter a person's behavior. And there are times where deception is warranted, but we are very, very restrictive about using deception in research. And the general principle is that deception is not permitted unless it can be justified that the results are going to be compromised if you don't use deception. And it's upon the institutional review board, the ethics board, to evaluate your position and determine whether deception is legitimately justified. You may want to use deception, and the IRB might say to you, no, there's another way to do this study without deception, and here's how. So you might have an application for research rejected and required to be revised that doesn't use deception. But why do I talk to you about straightforward manipulations and deception? Because the vast majority of research, it's 10 times more likely that a person is going to use a straightforward manipulation. So the vast majority do not include deception. But that isn't where we don't operate in black and whites. So when justified, when it is legitimate, then we allow deception. However, anytime you use deception, you have to do something called debriefing. And we debrief the participants about the true nature of the study after they participate. Now, debriefing can occur immediately after they participate or immediately after data collection is done. But before you use their data, before you include their actions or responses into your publication, you have to meet with them, whether it be face to face, over the phone, Zoom, and explain to them what the true nature of the study was, why deception was necessary, and you have to give them the option to withdraw their participation after the fact. So, in order for you to use data, people have to agree to participate. They didn't have all the information needed to know whether they wanted to participate. So that's why in the debriefing, you give them the opportunity to withdraw their participation as well. So that's deception and debriefing. Now, I alluded to the concept of informed consent. Notice that there are two words: informed consent. Consent means you're agreeing to participate. But unlike websites where they say, if you agree to all these terms, click here, and it's this like fine print that nobody ever reads, when it comes to research, there's called an informed consent form. And it, like I said, it goes through the purpose of the study, the risks involved with the study, the benefits involved with the study, the alternatives to participating in the study. If there are other things you can do, let's say we're thinking about doing a drug study, and there are other ways that the person can receive treatment outside of your experiment, you have to tell them. You have to avoid pain wherever possible. You have to provide information as to who the head of the IRB was. And if there was an adverse action, have to give them an opportunity to speak to whoever it was. But that's informed consent, giving a person all of the information needed to agree to participate. And I think that's important, right? Because if I ask you, hey, do you want to participate in this study? I'll give you $1,000. Maybe a lot of you would raise your hand. Yeah, I'll do it. Not even knowing what the study entails. So we have to be very careful with that because that's coercive. And we have to be able to tell you, hey, here's what the study is about. Here's the potential risks involved with the study. Here's the benefits involved with the study. And with knowing everything you know, do you want to participate? Now, consent is an ongoing process. So just because you have them sign the consent form in the beginning, typically, doesn't mean that they can't change their mind. In the consent form, you have to tell them that at any point you feel uncomfortable, you have the right to withdraw from the study. So informed consent requires a continuous consent. Now, what do we do with people who cannot give full consent? How do we handle children in research? How do we handle people with mental illness in research? How do we handle people with low IQ in research, or dementia or cognitive decline in research? Well, we require both consent of the participant and assent of an additional party, a responsible party. So when it comes to children, we have to get both the parent and the child's approval for them to participate in the research. What happens if the parent wants the child to participate, but the child doesn't want to participate? Well, guess what? Can't use that child. What happens if the child wants to participate and the parent doesn't want them to participate? Can't use it. So both parties, the individual themselves and a responsible party or guardian for them, have to approve the participation in the study. If anyone changes their mind, all bets are off. Now, what do you do with infants? Infants don't understand a consent form. You use their body language, you use their behavior. So if the parent wants the child to participate, but the child is nonverbal or an infant, and their nonverbal actions imply they're not interested, you can't force them into the study. And there's a lot of research on cognitive development and motor development and so forth that uses infants. So we have to pay attention to not just the verbals of the child or parent, but also the nonverbals. And an additional thing we have to be mindful is that we cannot cause pain or discomfort to a research participant that is outside of the norm, right? That is outside of reasonable, right? Now, pain or discomfort can come in a physical form or a psychological form, but we have to go out of our way to avoid discomfort to the participant as much as possible. Now, if you're doing a exploratory surgery and you agree to be part of a clinical trial, obviously a surgery comes with some pain, but that level of pain is understood as an expected risk relative to what you're doing. So if the harm or pain is no greater than everyday life, uh, psychological stress like missing a bus, let's say, or a train, that level of distress usually gets approved. But if it's greater than what you would expect in everyday life, then the IRB has the right to reject this study. Now, you might say, well, why is it so important to avoid pain and discomfort in research? Why is it so important to get informed consent? What if I told you there was no ethical research guidelines before 1948? And people historically have taken advantage of vulnerable populations. If you look at the Holocaust, prisoners in concentration camps were subjected to all kinds of unethical, cruel, inhumane experiments without their consent, without any sense of is this going to cause pain or not? There was no regard. So, believe it or not, the first proper standard of research is the Nuremberg Code that comes out in the late 1940s after World War II. But before that, there wasn't as much of a focus. And we'll talk more about that as we get through other research studies and the ethics behind it. And you might say, well, how is this study allowed to be done? How is this, how is this ethical? Some studies that even psychologists did historically, we would argue are unethical by today's standards. So we need guidelines. We need guidelines to protect the general public. And the Institutional Review Board, their job is not to be in service of the researcher, but the Institutional Review Board is designed to be in service of the general public. Okay. Another concern when people participate in research is everybody has the right to privacy and confidentiality. Now, privacy in research is you have the right to respond or not respond to anything that you're asked. If you don't want to answer a question, you have the right not to answer the question. Confidentiality is, let's say you did answer a question. Let's say you were doing research on substance abuse. And substance abuse, as I said in another video, is still a taboo in many cultures. If a person was honest about using substances of abuse, you have a responsibility to protect that information and make sure it doesn't get out, right? So a participant has the right to confidentiality. If they fill out a survey, there are ways that we protect their confidentiality. The first thing you could do is de-individualize it. You might have a person's consent form separate from their responses, right? You might have it entirely anonymous so that you can't reconnect a response to an individual. If you have computer-based data, you have to have it password protected. Physical data, you have to have it locked away in filing cabinets in a secure location. So we take participants' confidentiality very seriously. right? We don't just leak it. Imagine I did a study and I said, hey, I need participants. And let's say some students agreed to participate. And then the next class, I report your findings to the rest of the class, like your behavior. You wouldn't be too happy about that. Maybe you wouldn't have even participated if you knew. So we go to great lengths to make sure that does not happen. By the way, there is another issue related to the example I gave you, which is generally speaking, it's not a good practice to collect data from your own students because there is a coercion factor. I'm responsible for your grade. There is a power differential. You might feel obligated to participate in a study that I'm doing. If I ask you to participate, you might say, well, if I participate, maybe he'll give me this bonus or whatever. And if I don't participate, maybe I'll get this punishment. So it's very bad practice to collect data on your own students. Not that you can't collect data on students in general, but you don't use your students as your sample. So these are just a few of the guidelines as it relates to ethics with human beings. But as I said, we also have a responsibility to animals in research. Now, there are some people who will say, I don't agree with animal research altogether, right? And I understand that. I understand a person might feel that way. Now, the first thing I would ask that person to determine that they're being genuine about their disapproval is whether they eat meat. Now, you might say, well, why would you ask a person whether they eat meat? Well, simple. 95% of animals that are slaughtered for food consumption. You might say, okay, well, I got to eat. But at least you're starting to say, hey, wait, there is a time where animals might need to be sacrificed for something greater. I would then ask them, hey, do you wear leather or any kind of animal product? Um, they might say yes or no. And then I would say, well, why is that important? Because about 4% of animals that are slaughtered are for leather or some kind of animal clothing product. So if you wear leather sneakers or a leather belt and it's genuine leather, well, an animal had to die for you to get those sneakers. And if you're opposed to animal research, but you're wearing leather products, then you're disingenuous. So, what does that leave us? It leaves us with roughly about 1% of animals that actually die in research. That's what's left. And that 1% is responsible oftentimes for medicine. I would ask you, do you take medicine when necessary? Well, before we can do human trials, we do animal trials, right? And make sure that the medication is safe. And if you take medication, well, then you're being disingenuous. And then after all of that, I would say, and by the way, the vast majority of animals that are part of research are not sacrificed, they're not killed. In fact, any college you will see have something called a vivarium. And a vivarium is where animals that were part of a research study live. And if you have animals as part of research, you're responsible for their protection. You're responsible for providing adequate food, shelter, temperature, medical. You have to have, according to ethics guidelines, you have to have a veterinarian on staff and so forth. And if it's not required as part of the research to harm or kill the animal, you're not allowed to do it, which means that, let's say one of our colleagues does pigeon research, and pigeon research has been done for a long time for principles of learning and behaviorism. Well, we have pigeons that are over 10 years old in our vivarium. So at the College of Staten Island, you'll see in the biology building 6S, if you go down to the lower floor, 002, that's our vivarium. We have animals there that will live their whole life with proper food, medical attention, etc. Because if it's not necessary, you're not allowed to injure or kill an animal in the name of science. So that's just a um, brief introduction to research ethics with animals. I could give a whole semester's class on all of the things that are necessary when you do animal research. Now, I've defended animal research by using the argument: do you eat meat? Do you wear a leather product? Do you take medication? Even though I'm a strong proponent for animal research, me personally, I'm not one to do it. I don't feel comfortable doing animal research myself, but I will not um, oppose it because I know it's sometimes necessary. Okay. Now, I mentioned to you the Institutional Review Board, or the IRB. The IRB is responsible for reviewing every study that comes in, particularly with human beings. And their job is to decide whether uh, a, a research protocol is approved or not. Their job is to decide whether or not I can actually do what I want to do in research. And as I said, there are many times that research is not allowed. Now, I mentioned the IRB for human research. We also have an ethics board for animal research. So it's called the IACUC, IACUC, which is an institutional animal care and use committee. So it's similar to the IRB, but it's designed to make sure animal research follows the general laws of the state or country, as well as the general ethical principles set forth in our ethics code. So I'm sure many of you probably have not given that much thought as to when animals are used for research, how much consideration is given. Now, there are organizations like PETA who come out and oppose animal research or whatnot. But unlike the makeup industry, which does not necessarily have an IRB or an IACUC, when it comes to institutions like colleges or any institution that receives federal funding, they have to follow ethical guidelines. So if you ever hear about an animal research study, it went to an IACUC. If you ever hear about a human research study, it went to an IRB to determine the safety and the ethical nature of a study. We're not mad scientists going around and just tinkering with people. So that is our lesson on research ethics, which I think is an important companion when you're talking about research, is to talk about research ethics.